Hi, thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it. My name is Kirill Perian. I'm here with Jeremy Black, my partner. We represent data-driven solutions, and we help you get answers from the data. Just leave it at that. So we had a client that we've been developing some solutions for. So this experience came from that client experience, and we thought it would be a good topic to put up, and also to kind of wrap your brain around the structure of the topic, right? So you kind of do a lot of things for many months, and you kind of step back and start thinking about it. It's a really good way to kind of understand the domain and also do a little bit more research, so your presentation is actually valuable, as opposed to like, oh, here's what we did. And so we have a combination of, in our presentation, we have a combination of that, and we're going to toggle with Jeremy. He's going to jump into like some real specifics and kind of show you the nuts and bolts of some of those topics. So basically, when you're building a solution for a client with a multilingual base, right, you kind of have to account for the multi-language support in your solution, right? So what that means, in order for them to interact with it, the whole experience needs to happen in their native language. And so that was one of the things that they said up front. We kind of needed in 2 languages. We're gonna show you. I mean, the number of languages is unlimited. I mean, it's just gonna increase a little bit in complexity, but essentially that's what we started with. So therefore, some kind of automated translation, and the word automated I say in quotation marks, because we don't feel like it's fully automated, but at the same time, Power BI isn't there yet to fully automate the translation solution in Power BI. And so it does present a number of challenges and limitations. So we're here to talk about those challenges and share them with you, and also the capabilities. Okay, so our outline is going to be, we already kind of already did the problem statement. So we're going to talk about what are those elements of the multi-language solution. Our goal was to publish it into service, so it's not a Power BI report server type of solution. And then we're going to wrap up and have some takeaways. And then the Q&A, of course. So the statement was, we need a multi-language Power BI reporting solution, and it needed to be published to the Power BI service, and please automate the update process and the publish process, different language versions as much as possible. So that was kind of the task, right? And then, so let's talk about what are those elements. So the interface translation, the object metadata, sometimes it's called semantic model translation, and then also the data translation. And so what we mean by the interface, it's either a Power BI desktop version itself, or a PBIS service default language version. And Jeremy's going to get into a little bit more detail on that. What is object metadata? It's the tables, the columns, the measures, right? And the data, obviously, mainly it's a text data. There's some ways to deal with calendar type of data. Some of it's dealt with automatically by our Power BI service in the interface, and some of it is, you kind of have to customize your solution a little bit. Okay, so as far as the interface translation goes, that's kind of the first of the 3, right? So those are your menus, your buttons, your messages, and some of the other elements. So here, we'd like to not reiterate a whole lot of things, because this is the easiest part. The interface translation is really not that difficult. I think Microsoft already took care of it pretty well. So the first link is by Microsoft. And by the way, we're going to have the PDF version of this available after, so you can download all the links will be live, so you don't have to write anything up. So in this link, it explains pretty well of what all the different elements are of this interface and how to deal with it in Power BI service. So just go there and take a look at it. And then another one, the guy in the cube, he talks about there's a good YouTube video on the Power BI site. How that all works on the Power BI site, and kind of breaks a pretty good breakdown. Also between different browsers, because there's some peculiarities between Chrome and whether you use Edge or some other browser. So it's another good resource. Okay, so now I'm going to hand it off to Jeremy, and Jeremy's going to show you how to change those language settings in the Power BI service.
Thank you, Kirill. Okay, demo time. So we're jumping into the Power BI service, and as Kirill mentioned, this is the easiest piece. Why are we not on that screen? Okay. So in the Power BI service here, in order to change the language settings, all we have to do is go to our settings option, drop down to settings, go into language, and the default browser language is what is selected automatically. And normally you'd want to leave it there because it's automatically going to adjust to whatever the user's default language setting is. And so if their language setting is adjusted for their region, it's automatically going to adjust for them. But sometimes you're going to want to override that to see what their experience looks like. So you can see the language change for you without actually having to go in and change your browser settings. So we're going to override the language setting here. And one of the challenges you might have is some of these languages are actually going to be in the alphabet of that local language, so you have to know how it's spelled in that local language. So I'm going to go ahead and apply.
Why don't you teach Jeremy some Russian?
Yeah, kind of know how Russian is actually spelled in the Cyrillic alphabet. We're going to hit apply. And now we can see all of our menu items are translated into the Russian language for us. So Power BI takes care of all of that, and we don't have to do anything other than adjust that language settings. And for the users, their default browser is generally going to take care of that. But in this option, we are adjusting it so we can, again, have that user experience. I'm going to go ahead and jump over to a report. I'm actually having troubles with my screen here. 1 second. Maybe not duplicating. I'll make it work.
PowerPoint switched you to presentation mode.
Yeah.
You have to uncheck that checkbox on the.
Okay. So we're in the Russian language setting, and I'm going to jump over to a report that is published in English. So on this particular report, all the translations that are currently appearing on this page are only occurring due to the user interface. There's been no data translations, no metadata translations. The only translations that are occurring at this point are due to the UI. Let me go ahead and make that a little bit bigger for you. And I'm going to highlight a few of those items that are being translated. So if you look right there in the drop-down slicer, normally that would say all in English, but that has been translated into Russian. The number format for the sales measure, the separator for millions and thousands would normally have a comma, but here we see a space. Where we normally see a decimal, we have a comma. And again, that's all adjusting to the regional setting just with that language translation. Dropping down to our auto-generated titles, this would normally read sales and quantity by category name. So those conjunctions are part of the user interface. Changing that language setting is automatically making that adjustment for us. Awesome, we don't have to worry about that at all. And the next thing I want to point out is our unit of measure. Unit of measure, normally that would say K for thousands, but that has also been translated for us. So not only is the user interface dealing with those menus in the Power BI service, it also reaches into your report and translates some of those items on your report page. Let's go ahead and jump out of this report and go back to our English setting. Now, when you're wanting to get back, if you're not familiar with the language that you're changing to, you may want to actually make a screenshot to know where these settings are spatially. That was the first lesson learned for myself. I need to figure out how to get back where I came from. So it's a good idea to make a screenshot to know where those things are spatially so you can get back if you're going to play around with your language settings. So let's go ahead and see if I can remember. Okay, I did remember where it's located. Now, the nice thing about the language drop-down is the default setting is always going to be at the top, so I don't have to hunt for English. I just have to get back to the top of that listing and hit apply.
Yellow button.
The yellow button, yeah, that's another good indicator. And now we are back to our English language settings. And if I go back into that same report, and we were in the English categories, now you can see all. See our commas, our decimal place, our conjunctions in English, and our K for thousands is back. Okay, Kirill is going to present our next object.
Can I ask a question before you leave that
Yes,
page?
certainly.
You're in dollars there, and if you, is there any translation of the currency symbol?
No, that would be a translation that you would actually have to do in your data.
Okay.
And besides, the rubles to dollars aren't really one-to-one, so you'd have to figure something else out.
Well, I think the point is that if your values are in dollars, you want to express them in dollars.
Yeah.
Unless you're explicitly doing currency
Yeah,
translation.
yeah, it's just that last piece where it says K, it translates that automatically into the interface.
Okay,
What about the syntax in your measures and so on? How does that go?
We'll get there. This is just the interface piece.
let's get back to our user interface. Get back to that section that we were at. See if we can adjust that setting.
So this is so basically the next sort of 1/3 of our presentation, right, is on the object metadata translation. So as we mentioned, it's the table names, the column names, and the meta names. These are table names don't really require translation unless there's some way you want to show them in your visuals, right? So it's like what's behind the scene is behind the scene. Unless you need to use that word somehow in visuals, just take the minimalistic approach and not do that, right? Column names, kind of the same thing. The measure names are interesting. Measure names, I think, highlight the Power BI's deficiencies in that arena, and I'll explain why. So basically, let's see. Okay, we're back on the demo. But what I wanted to say is the object metadata translation is the most difficult part of the whole translation solution, right? So as I mentioned, the interface translation, for the most part, is done automatically. Power BI has done a pretty good job. Microsoft has done a pretty good job at that. The object metadata is where we're going to spend most of the time, and then we'll talk about the data translation in the end. So Jeremy is going to show a little bit of demo there on language culture parameters, translating some titles, dynamically changing column headers, and some challenges with that, and then also kind of a manual workaround how do we change measure names on column names.
So did they want this for both an English audience and the other's
Yeah,
language?
they said that up front, but we kind of maximize the development time more so on the design side, because you don't want to screw around with designs too much in both languages. But yeah, they kind of stated up front that they wanted in English and in Russian.
Okay.
So.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah.
So maybe before he starts, could you just be explicit about where your metadata is being stored? Because there's multiple options of where your metadata can be stored for Power BI.
Yeah.
So I think most of the room is probably on one paradigm, but there might be others that are on a different paradigm.
Yeah.
Sure.
Just quickly.
Sure. Yeah, so we'll try to go over the metadata elements and then let us know if we don't get those covered. So again, the metadata is going to consist of the table names, your column headers, your field names, and your measure names. So one of the struggles we have with the metadata is we really didn't find any way of dynamically changing the measure names. We could not find a solution within Power BI to dynamically change the actual names of measures, and we didn't find a way of dynamically changing the table names. Certainly you could have multiple tables name different things and they can live side by side, but you couldn't swap out in any way the table name for the English version to a Russian version to a Spanish version. Now, in our particular use case, we didn't need to build our data model for the end user to build reports off of. So we didn't have to worry about translating the table names. All we had to worry about is how to deal with those field header names and in some cases, the measure names. So those are the two items that we're going to focus on. And the one thing that drives all of the data translation is this language parameter that we built out here. So I'm going to jump in to our parameter. Actually, the wrong section here. Zoom in on that so you can see it. And in this particular demo file, we set it up to support 3 different languages. As you can see, we have English, Russian, and Spanish. And this is not just a simple language code, but it also shows the language and the region where that is at. So this is English as written in the US, Russian as written in Russia, and Spanish as written in Mexico. And Power BI actually calls this parameter culture in the background. And I've seen it other places listed as locale, but the official ISO standard, I believe, is called culture if you're looking for that list of codes. We happen to call it select language code just to make it user-friendly, and so it's easy to understand what that parameter was for. So the first item we're going to look at is actually the report title right here. If I go to that item, that is a text measure that we have created. And this is a very simple text measure that we've built, and it's just a simple switch statement. It's looking at the selected language code and saying if it detects the Russian language parameter, it's going to give us a Russian language title. If it detects the Spanish language parameter, we're going to get a Spanish title. And if no language code is selected, we're going to get the default of the English title. Now you may notice this isn't necessarily metadata. This is actual data. It's a measure value. But the reason I'm pointing this out in the metadata section here is because we're using this as a workaround for metadata. We're using the result of this measure value to present a title, which is measure data, which is metadata. The titles that are auto-generated in Power BI are generated from measure names and field names. And creating your own text measure where you control the values in there is one way that you can work around the fact that you cannot actually dynamically edit those measure names. Okay, so moving on to the next element of metadata, column names. So we have some good news and bad news on that. The good news is you can dynamically change column header names. The bad news is you can see from these visuals is they break. Every time you change the language code, your visuals break. So it's not a very stable solution, and you can only view the visual in the language you have selected at the time that language code parameter is there. But I at least wanted to show you how that's done and talk about why we did not select that as an option. So let's go ahead and jump into the query editor. And show how we start. How we start is just making a copy of our table headers. So we have 4 column headers in our categories table, and it's just category ID, language code, which we actually added to this particular table, category name, and category description. And in this particular case, we're only worried about translating the category name and the category description, because those are the only columns that are presented in the visuals. The other items, the category ID, the language code, that's all background information that's hidden, so there's no need to translate that. You could if you wanted to, but it's an unnecessary step. And then we've added another language code here. This language code applies to the header, whereas this language code here applies to the data that we're going to be talking about later on, just to make that distinction. The next step is we fill in the blank values with null for these non-translated items. We fill down to make sure all those non-translated items have values. And then here's the critical step, which probably can't see that too well. Is we basically want to filter on our language code column and set it equal to our language code parameter. And that just ensures that we only return one record, one set of headers that is translated that we're going to end up applying to our data table.
That's
And
a
then,
question.
yes, go ahead.
So what is this data source again? I saw it was a JSON document, but where's it coming from?
Oh, this one is just a manually data entered translation table, but it
Okay.
certainly could be set up in a database, it could be set up in a CSV file, an Excel file, what have you. But in this particular case, we just data entered it right in a table.
Okay, thanks.
Yes.
Would you be kind enough to repeat questions? It might be difficult sometimes. Like he was talking directly away from me. I didn't hear what the question was.
Okay, his question was, what was the source of this particular data table?
Thank you.
And in this particular case, it was just manually data entered.
Have you ever done any of this with analysis services?
That is one of our recommendations, actually, if you want a fully supported language translation.
We'll let you get there.
Analysis Services does support that capability, and that would probably be our recommendation if you really needed to scale this up and needed that full support. That's a good point. Okay, so the next step, let me just go ahead and show the translation. I'm going to switch it to Spanish. Hit preview. And you can see our column headers are now in Spanish. Change it again to Russian. Hit preview. We now have our column headers in Russian. Next step, now that we have our column headers, is to actually apply that to our data table, which in this case, our data table source is just the Northwind database, so it's actually in a SQL database. The steps in this query are to grab that original data table of our categories. Get on the right step here. We are demoting the original headers from that table. We're removing those original headers to get rid of them. And then we're appending that query that we had just created that translates our new headers. And as you can see, they're at the bottom and translated into Russian. We're now going to reverse the sort order to get those new headers at the very top. Promote the headers. So now we have a newly translated headers. Reverse the order of the data. So now it's back in its original sort order before we started manipulating it. And then we're going to change the data types to make sure the data types are set appropriately. Now up to this point, all the transformations that I've done have all been through the UI. No custom M code at all, just going through the menus and selecting. Except for this step. So this step we had to do a little bit of adjustments, but nothing too crazy. Because the names of those column headers are going to change when the language changes, we couldn't just leave the column names in there when we're setting the data types. We actually had to do relative reference for the column to ensure every time those column headers change, this step isn't going to break. It's going to say, I don't know what that field is anymore. So we did a relative reference, starting with our 0 index, column 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now it's going to recognize those columns no matter what they're called. Now I'm only translated the last 2, but I went ahead and did a relative reference for all 4 just in case. Decide to translate the other ones later. Let's go ahead and apply that. And we will see it break. Well, one will actually become fixed and another one will break. So our middle report in Russian now works. I can see both layers. Click on that. That's the category description. That's the category name. If I go back to the English report, you can see on the axis, you get a little warning symbol here. It doesn't know what those categories mean anymore. It has lost the reference. But it's waiting for them. It's still holding on to that name in the background. And if it appears again, it will become live again. So if I come over here to this Spanish report and I edit my parameter, just like I did with the Russian one, I hit apply, it's now going to make that report live, and the one next to it is going to break. Now you may have noticed the title hasn't changed this whole time, and that's just because the DAX expression hasn't been refreshed. But let me go ahead and refresh that one just so you can see that. Let's see. There we go. I need to click on it, but no, I need to click on the right box. It always helps.
So when you have these visualizations that like kind of like break, do you have them on different tabs? And then like, depending on the language, it will go to that tab? Or you just replicate the visualization?
So while Jeremy is figuring it out, you see how that affects your design, right?
Mm-hmm.
So now we've determined that on the same page, we can now display multiple language visualizations.
Right.
So immediately we're saying, okay, different PBIS files, right? So so you can kind of like translate it and then publish it in the manner that everything is in a different language, so it's viewable in the service that way, and it ends up being a different PBIS file.
As opposed to going to a different tab.
Yeah.
And doing that.
Yeah.
Well, we'll get to that, but the master file, I'll show it later. I kind of have the flow chart for you. But the master file does have several tabs. You know, when you publish it, you hide the ones that you don't need.
Yeah, yeah.
But the other PBX files, you just make a copy of the master one and you delete everything you don't need.
Now the one curious thing I noticed is that I can go in and manually change the names of these headers and it won't break. So if I come in here and I go to edit queries, and I decide that I want in this last step just to call this something totally different, and I hit close and apply, Power BI is smart enough to know to go behind the scenes and update that column header and update the visuals, and it doesn't break. But the frustrating thing is if I put a parameter on that, and I've tried a billion different ways to fool it into working, it breaks every single time. But if you do it manually, it knows the sequence to go through to make all those update steps to refresh it. So I don't know if this is a bug or a feature, but as far as being able to automate this, I have not been able to figure out a way to get that to work.
Brian, of what's going on there?
Yeah, so it's the newer half of a feature that's kind of nice. So the idea is when you rename a column here, just in the main viewer, it'll actually, without telling you, it'll go update the query, and it'll match those two things together. That way, you know, when the query engine passes the thing off passes the query off the compressor, the column names match. It looks like they built in some additional functionality to kind of do the opposite. So if you go change as your last step in the query editor the name of something, it's smart enough to realize, oops, this is no longer going to match a column in the data model. So it goes and updates the information in the data model.
Oh, okay.
I think.
Is there any way that a context filter would help that?
Someone else feel bad. Okay. Sorry, I missed the question.
So, yeah, her question was, is there any way a context filter could help that? Maybe you'll say more about that.
Yeah, I'm thinking a little bit more about a little bit more complex data model where you're actually looking at the user and the user's region and what their default language would be, and then you could create some DAX around a context filter that might be able to help you process that information. Just a thought. I'm not a programmer.
If I understand the question you're right, you're asking, is there a way to detect what language the user is preferring?
Yeah, from your user roles and creating more sophisticated table in your data model that might have more user information in it.
Well, that sounds like user-based security, and I think certainly you could have user-based security that would restrict what folks could see, like what data set someone would have access to.
Okay, well, if you can't do it for language, that's fine.
But as far as being able to dynamically change the headers, the main problem that we have is once that language changes from one language to the next, the visual that it's connected with will break. So I can't have a single report that's connected to multiple languages that will move from language to language without breaking. This forces you to have multiple versions of that, and that one report will only stay live while it's connected to that language because it has a reference to an actual name, not an underlying ID in the background.
And again, the use case for having like multiple language visuals on the same page is very rare. Like, you know, like if I'm a user from Spain, for example, I would typically go in the Power BI service, find whatever I can understand in Spanish and click on that, right? And it'll present me the whole package in my language, as opposed to trying to like force the service to detect where did the user come from, did they change their default browser setting or not? You know, maybe they are multilingual, maybe they want to see it in a different language. So it's more of a, I guess, and especially for the development in the PBIX, you really don't want to make those decisions at the PBIX level.
Just some thoughts on that. I mean, having done this kind of thing in reporting services in the past, where anything can be based on an expression, and then you can use some combination of data-driven labeling with expressions. You know, we can pretty much change the name of anything, oftentimes with a lot of labor.
Yeah.
But we know that expression-based properties are coming at some point in Power BI. So, you know, maybe that will help us kind of harden this approach and make it a little more.
We'll continue hammering at it until we find an easier way. I mean, this is just kind of like a sharing moment here.
Did y'all see the roadmap that just got published here a few days ago? Yeah, it's this expression capability is coming in this next September or April to September time.
And the XML endpoint, which again gives you programmatic control over the model.
Okay, those are good questions. Thank you.
Yeah, so one of the ways that we kind of powered through it to work with the current limitations, which was very painful and a bit manual, was to replicate our report pages. So we have replicated report pages here in English, Russian, and Spanish in our demo file here. And in this particular case, I'm looking at our Russian version of this particular page. And the translations that you currently see on this page are manually created. We actually had to go in to each object and go into the field in the visual, go to rename, and apply the translation right there.
Yeah.
So as you can see, that's very manual. But it's stable, and you have full control over those translations. The only upside, if there is one, is that it does give you the ability to make adjustments to your visuals, because sometimes, especially with like the Russian language here, they can get very long, and the objects may not have contained that translated word. So it at least gives you a chance to get your hands on that object with the translation and make sure the width and size is adjusted appropriately after that translation. Of course, I would prefer that it's fully automated and test all the languages and make sure the visuals are adjusted to the widest language that we're using and not have to go through this manual process.
And a lot of times you resort to abbreviations, and those have to make sense to the native speaker, right? So a lot of times, you know, to the point of manually translating everything is not always possible, because not only there's an industry lingo to deal with, but there's also the native language abbreviations that you may or may not know at a certain level of mastery.
And again, just object by object, we've gone through, made those translations, and an important thing we noted is not only the items that are visual on the report, but of course you have tooltips to worry about. If anything you've added to the tooltips, you want to make sure you've done those translations as well. And then to ensure that anything that the customer might view is going to be translated appropriately. And in this particular case with this manually generated title, we also noticed that even though, as we mentioned in the user interface, it is handling those conjunctions, sometimes they just may not make sense. So the way that sentence is structured together, the words are appropriate, but the structure of the words may not be appropriate. So again, it's probably a better idea to create those text measures and control your titles yourself, and consult with a native language speaker and ensure that that translation is correct. Otherwise, you'll get some unusual responses from the customer wondering what the heck you're thinking.
This is just a question about sort of curiosity. Would it be at all possible to enlist a Cortana translation engine to dynamically return a reasonable, fluent translation dynamically?
Reasonable is a relative term,
Yeah, totally that.
but actually there is a blog post, and Kirill does have a link to that in one of his slides, where I forget who, but I think he has a reference to that, where someone actually did a demo of calling an API.
Yeah, Microsoft Translator API.
And returning a result. But I just know myself, with going and doing Google translations, you don't know if you're going to get a noun or a verb back on certain words. So the translations are definitely going to be questionable, but
Maybe
reasonable most times, probably. But obviously with industry jargon and having that uncertainty, I would prefer to stay away from any sort of automatic translation in a customer's product. But if you were just doing something for fun, I think it would be fun to play around with.
And that's why the frequent touch with the customer, or the product owner, if you will, helps, right? Because they can quickly see, oh, you know, this doesn't sound right, this doesn't look right. So we try to, our model for working with this particular customer is once a week we get, you know, kind of an agile style. We give them the demo, take all the feedback, prioritize that. It's very transparent, so they knew exactly what we're working on, what the next most important thing is, and they're pretty happy with that format.
Yeah.
So in this approach with the multiple tabs, are you still using your parameters or not?
We are, because we're still using our parameters to adjust our text measures. We're still using our parameters to adjust our data that we're going to show in a minute. And
I'll walk you through the process.
And one other thing we noticed on the filters is, like, if you apply your filters and then you change your language settings, all the visuals disappear because those filter items no longer exist. So every time you change your language parameter, it's important that you have to clear all of your filters from your reports, because they're no longer valid selections. Okay, so let's keep it moving here, because
I think we had one more.
Oh, sorry. Another question?
Just one item. Up in the upper right corner of the visual is the Espanol, Mexico sort of culture indicator. But it's not related to what's actually showing on the screen. So
yeah, and that's just because that's part of a DAX measure that's being brought to the foreground, and you have to refresh the model completely in order for those DAX measures to recalculate.
Yeah, we just don't want to continuously refresh.
Just one.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're getting short on time here. So the one quick thing that I was going to talk about in the last piece is the data translation. So we talked about the we talked about the interface, we talked about the metadata translation or semantic model translation. That's where most of the challenges we encountered. So now let's talk about the data translation. So the types of data that is requiring translation. Obviously, not everything requires translation. Numeric formatting that is occurring in the Power BI service does not, it's done automatically for you by the Power BI service. Jeremy's going to talk a little bit later about the specific use case for this, the system date time. So if you use the format function of DAX, it requires some TLC, tender loving care, because sometimes it just, when you move from one culture link to the next, from one language to the next, it just keeps it, because that's the way you specified it to be, right? So there's some peculiarities there. But one option, like somebody mentioned here, is to go and see what you can get done automatically, right? There's Microsoft Translator IP out there in the Azure Marketplace. We have a link there for you. It's good for translating data, like simple data, like butter, salt, things like that. But again, when you're working for a customer, there's like a very specific industry thing, industry jargon, or specific terminology. You might want to be careful with that. But it's certainly, we kind of played around with it. It's a fun thing to do. You add a translation, boom. If you have 5 languages, it translates them all on the fly. It's pretty cool experience. Another video we have, and so we kind of scoured all over the place trying to find if somebody did this already or has done this before. Again, manually created translation tables. I believe this one's Ruth Pozuelo from Kerbal.com. She has this kind of like, so we use a similar approach, but not quite the same. And Jeremy will explain why. So, any questions? No?
Okay, jumping back into our query editor, we're going to talk about the steps needed to actually dynamically translate our data. And so luckily that is actually a capability that we can do, and we leverage our language parameter to finally accomplish that. So with our category translation, we have our category translation staging. And again, we started with a manually created translation table, but again, this could be stored in a database or an external file and connected to. We made a copy of our category table, at least our category ID, our category name, our category description, the items that are going to be translated. Now, one thing we did is that we created an additional adjustment to the names of the field. We added the language code parameter right to those field names. So when we added the additional field names with the translation, we were able to add those language codes as well. So we have the category name in Russian, the description in Russian, and you see the language code that is just space separated, and then we have all the translations within this table. So that is the first step, getting your translations prepared, ready, and into a table in this particular format. In this particular case, we removed those columns that had the English columns in them. We really just used that for convenience to help with our translation step, but we didn't want manually entered data that existed in another place. Deleted that out and ensured that those category IDs are coming from our original data source in case they're ever adjusted. We're getting the real data from the actual source. And the last step there, I just deleted one of those translations because I wanted to show what happens if you're missing a translation, because doing quality checks on things like this is going to be important. Jumping over to our categories table, we start with the categories table and we merge in our translation table. Now our translation table is going to have translations for 2 different columns in 2 different languages, so 4 additional columns. And you'll notice the nulls at the bottom. That's because I deleted that one translation and I built in some quality steps to deal with that. I created a parameter for default Russian word and a parameter for default Spanish word. And what happens when it finds no translations, it fills in those missing spaces with the Russian word for translation needed and the Spanish word for translation needed. And there's also a separate query that could be used by an administrator to show those missing translations in an administrator report, so you can help manage that. We unpivot the columns. We split them out, so now we have the column names and the language code in two separate columns. And we pivot on those category names. So there's a lot of pivoting and unpivoting to get this structured in the way you want, but finally we have the data in a structure we want. For each category code, we have 3 different languages with the category name and the category description. So we have our translated table. And then just like we did with the column headers, we apply that language parameter filter to ensure we only have one data set that's going to be returned out to our reports. So in this particular case, I'm going to go ahead and change this to our Russian parameter. Hit close and apply. And as soon as it's done processing, the data is going to be translated into the Russian language for us. So now all the data elements have been converted over. You can see in our slicer, we have the Russian language.
And again, just to reiterate, to translate the metadata, you have to actually refresh the whole solution. Not just the Power Query side. Not just the parameter part.
Yeah, and the rest of the interface has to be published up to the service to handle that piece. Now, there's a special handling of date elements, and that's what this next slide shows, is how the date text elements are handled specially. Now, luckily, you don't have to create translation tables for the text components of dates if you use M date tables, or at least you use M steps to create those columns for the text date elements. So this is showing which text elements are automatically translated for you using built-in M date functions. So we have the week short name, or the day of a week short name, the day of week long name, the month short name, and the long month name. As long as we use those M date functions, it has a built-in culture parameter that we can leverage, and it will handle those translations for us automatically. Let me go ahead and jump over to our query editor. Go into that date table. If I go to the month name, we can see that M function, date.month_name. Feeded our date field, and this is where the culture parameter is, and we're feeding it our language code parameter to ensure that it's translating at the language that we want. So now every time we add those text date columns, it is translating for us, and we don't have to provide it the translation tables, which is great that it's handling that piece for us.
So is the workflow that you refresh this and publish out for each language and then schedule each one to refresh? Is that?
Yes,
okay.
Exactly. Now, there may be text elements of dates that aren't handled automatically, and those items you'd have to create your own M formulas or functions, and it could be simple if statements, or you could create more complex functions. We don't have time to get into that today, but you may have, for example, half-year prefixes, quarter-year prefixes, fiscal years, fiscal periods. Those aren't handled, but you could certainly create your own formulas to deal with those translations. One thing I wanted to note is the automatic date hierarchy doesn't play well with the date translations, so I wouldn't recommend using that. I would recommend using your own date hierarchies. For example, the quarter, no matter what the regional settings are in Power BI desktop or the Power BI service, that never translates. I did notice that the month will translate in the regional settings for Power BI desktop, but it's fixed once you publish it. It does not translate in the service. So it's just too inconsistent. Don't recommend using that one. I think that was the main thing I wanted to talk about on that particular page, but let's talk about a few date measures just to round up the date discussion. So I created an example of 3 date measures in different formats. So the very top one here is all numeric, I guess except for the slashes and colons. And the next 2 are date or text and numeric format. So the first item is actually built just using our standard formatting option. So if I hover over format, a little tooltip pops up, and you don't have to read that whole thing, but it basically says any item with an asterisk in the date format is automatically going to adjust to the regional setting. And there's a couple at the top that if I go in here and I go to date time, these 2 are automatically going to adjust to the regional setting for you. Now, date items with text in them are automatically going to translate as well. But again, it may not make much sense as far as the sequence of items, because in the local region, having the dates in that particular order just would not be normal. So even though the words can be read, you might not want to use them just because they should be presented in a different order. But if you use these numeric ones, they'll be presented in a way that they would be used to.
So if there's a time with no asterisk, that means it's going to show in like UTC time?
If it's no asterisks, it means there's just no regional adjustment.
Okay.
There's a language adjustment if there's a text element, but there's no additional adjustment. What you see is what you get, basically.
The actual time will be the same, but the way it's showing is not really adjusted for locale.
Oh.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then this last item here is actually created using the DAX format. And the one note on that one is that actually translates it into a text. And so it does not translate in the service because it's now a text element and it's fixed. So whatever it is at the time you publish it, it's going to stay that way. So let's go ahead and jump to the service real quick. And let's change our language settings. Now I just want to show you how those dates are going to convert in the service for us automatically. You'll notice that this date time format has adjusted based upon the regional settings. These words have automatically translated. Again, that probably would not make sense to a Russian speaker to see the date in that format. And this DAX formatted function did not translate at all. So there's a difference depending on how you format those date items. Okay, so Kirill's going to talk a little bit more about the publishing sequence.
Yeah, so I know we're running short on time, so.
Are we out?
We'll just make
You guys got a little bit.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Just real quick, in your research, is there a locale DAX function? Is there a way to get the language of the user in DAX?
Not at this time. We haven't found one.
For your use case there, with that last date, you said that it will come out translated in whatever language you publish it in. So as long as you because you said you were publishing 3 different versions of this report.
Mm-hmm.
So as long as you were cautious to publish it with the correct parameter,
correct.
It would stay fixed.
I'll take you through our
Okay.
process of actually publishing it, because we have to think through it to make sure there are no errors like that. Like, oh, I forgot to change the parameter, or I forgot to refresh my,
So your parameter could build a field that you could then reference in DAX in a switch or an if statement to change your format.
Potentially.
Yeah.
Yeah, we haven't tried it, but. Okay, so let's talk about the publishing, right? So, actually, too far. No, it looks right. Okay, so now that we know that we can't really switch languages on the fly in the same solution to present visuals side by side in 3 different languages, we now need to make a design decision of completely split them out in different PBIS files, and in fact organize our apps and workspaces in a way to support those multiple languages, right? So really it's about kind of designing that publishing process and managing that master PBIS file that I referred to earlier. So think about this. So we have this master version, English. I call it English Plus because it has, you know, everything in it, and anything that's besides English is hidden. All the tabs, all the report pages. So then what happens is I publish that to English App Workspace. I update my English app, so it can. I don't understand why I have to update the app. Like you would think that if it's under the app, the workspace should just be automatic, but you have to update the app for now. On the other thread, you kind of go down and you make copies. So let's say I'm going to make a Russian copy of the whole thing. Then what I do is I go and delete out all the English tabs out of there, so there's no, and unhide the Russian tabs, right? So they're visible and they're publishable. Because if you publish the whole solution to the service, you won't see the pages that are hidden, but funny enough, and I don't know if that changed recently, you could download a PowerPoint off of it and it will have it. So something fell through the cracks, I think. But anyway, so again, this is where your question comes in, right? I copy it, I change the parameter first to Russian, let's just say, then I refresh the whole thing to make sure all the metadata is hooked up and the data actually translates. So it becomes like its own completely different language version, right? Then I publish that to the service, it's kind of the same thing, and update the respective apps. Then if it's in Spanish, I do kind of like follow the same process. And then it's the same thing. So like Jeremy mentioned earlier, I do have to go and update any of those default text filters because, you know, it doesn't see them anymore. So if you had it on a specific month, right, I'd have to repoint it to the same month. And then the last step is to really just, if you have any tiles or dashboards, and everybody knows what dashboard is in Power BI, right? We all talk about dashboards, but Power BI is a very specific notion of a dashboard. You also have to update those. It's kind of like taking your development, they don't exist in PBIS, right? It's taking your development out of one environment and making sure it's, you know, updated and in sync in the other environment. So that's the basic process of how we organize the publishing and the updating process. Any questions? Okay. And then, let's see. Do we have time for 5 more minutes or?
Go for it.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's just showing kind of what a final report would look like.
Yeah, because you want to see the final solution. You don't want to have a mixture of the Russian and Spanish and English. That's the cream.
Okay, so once you have a report fully published to the service, you have the data translated, you have your metadata manually translated, unfortunately, and it's published out there, your end user is going to get that fully immersive experience. Their menus are in Russian, their data's in Russian, metadata's in Russian, or whatever their local language is, and they're going to be able to experience that full report as they would expect. Now, in this particular one, I have some non-translated pages down here. In a final version, all the pages would be translated. It would be published to an app, and that app would have a name that's in that local language, and that would be the final version. But as you can see on this particular screen, everything is translated, all the numbers, all the drop-down filters, all the items they're gonna see are in that local language for them. Now, with that said, as we mentioned, the limitation with this is we did not go to the point of building a data model that the end user could start building their own reports off of, because in order to do that, they would expect translated table names, fully translated column names. If you need that type of experience, you probably would want to go to an SSAS type of solution. There is support for that. You know, there's these tools out there like Tabular Editor or Tabular Translator, where you can actually apply a translation layer on top of your SSAS tabular model. Now, I would think because this is built on the same technology, that would be coming to Power BI at some point, but I don't know what the roadmap for that looks like.
Chris would know.
Well, I think the XMLA endpoint that they've announced is step one. I don't know how far it'll take us.
Okay.
So the report that you just showed us in Russian, would you send a link to your Russian consumers so that they go to that report and not a different language?
Yeah, we
or-
would publish an app specifically in the Russian language, and the app would be named in Russian, and
And
just for
so
them.
Just those consumers would get that?
Yes.
And yeah, I mean, the link is the same, right? You just log into under your credentials into the account, and you'll have, you know, 3, like, let's just say we're building out the operations reports, right? And it'll say operations, it'll say operations in Russian, it'll say operations, so 3 different apps, and like as a native user of that language, you just
So
go
just
in,
click on the
click
right one.
the right one, and everything else will be fully translated.
Got it.
So roughly how many man-hours were invested in the
No, you
solution?
can't add that one.
Or weeks or months?
It would have been a lot more if I didn't know the language.
Yeah.
But, so we have, I think, one final slide there.
That was a serious question.
Why don't we talk about that?
Okay.
So basically, the wrap up to Paul's point is it's a complex process, right? Translation of the Power BI solution is still complex because of a lot of those manual workarounds and so different things you have to do, and mainly because it requires the understanding of all those underlying elements, right? And kind of a multi-stage approach even to publishing, right? Not to mention the management of the PBIS files. And the biggest hurdle, like, you know, so the takeaway number 2 is really just the lack of the metadata translation support within Power BI. Like Jeremy said, since, you know, it's available in SSIS, we would think that it would be on the roadmap at some point, because I can't think of, I mean, we're living in the age of multinational corporations, and, you know, obviously they want to present the same version of the truth to all the different consumers that they have in all the different countries, right? So I think that's a good opportunity for Power BI to continue developing that. And then the last thing is the manual translation of those measure names and field names. It just kind of adds up to, again, to Paul's point, to the development time and maintenance of those reports in different languages. And with that, if you have any additional questions, we're happy to take them. If not, thank you very much, and we appreciate you coming here.